Hi everyone, great. It's really great to be here. My name is Jordan McSwiney. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. And today I'm going to be talking about our work really on the way that violent extremism affects the public sphere and what can be done to perhaps make the public sphere more resilient through a case study of CVE in New South Wales in Australia. Now, this research and the report, which we launched a few weeks ago, is the product of a 6-month project that we did in partnership with our centre and the University of New South Wales and their Canberra campus. And it feeds into a larger multi-institutional Australian Research Council discovery project that we have at the centre, exploring public sphere responses to violent extremism. We're a research team that doesn't really have a background in security or prevention. Rather, we have expertise in multiculturalism, in deliberative democracy, in communication theory, and far-right extremism. We're very thankful also to the New South Wales government, which provided the funding to support this project as part of their 2022 Countering Violent Extremism program. And this funding and the project allowed us to try and, make connections across our fields to better understand how democratic societies can become more resilient in the face of violent extremism. So this morning, I want to first talk quite briefly about our approach, what the public sphere is, what we mean by democratic resilience, and why we think they're important in terms of addressing violent extremism. And then I want to focus on some of the practical ways forward, perhaps, that public sphere actors like government, like civil society organisations, like news media, can take to hopefully promote a democratically resilient public sphere based on our research. So this project draws on the notion of the public sphere as suggested by the theory of deliberative democracy, which is a normative theory about democratic legitimacy, about how democracies should function. And at the heart of deliberative democratic theory is this notion of a healthy public sphere, a site between the state on the one hand and the private world on the other, where citizens can communicate about issues of common concern. It's a communicatively constructed site where information is exchanged, public opinion is formed, and collective identities are articulated. But when the public sphere becomes fractured, it becomes polarised, it actually loses the capacity to generate the deliberation on which a healthy democracy depends. And so the actions of violent extremists, even when they may not be physically violent necessarily, can harm the public sphere and, by extension, democracy. And so these actions, which might range from, say, media stunts and propaganda to terrorism and political violence, they impact the public sphere in a variety of ways, but crucially, it doesn't happen in isolation, right? The effects and effect of violent extremism and violent extremist actions on and in the public sphere are dependent on the reaction and interaction of other public sphere actors, such as government, news media, civil society, and also, crucially, I think, everyday citizens. So drawing from deliberative democracy, we, reconceptualize democratic resilience. We take a specific focus on the well-being of the public sphere and the quality of public communications and their role in democracy in deliberative terms. So for us, a democratically resilient public sphere is one that sustains integrative and tolerant public discourses when subjected to shocks such as a violent extremist attack. A resilient public sphere has the capacity to contain and process provocations in a fashion that ideally maintains and perhaps even strengthens society's democratic integrity. By contrast, when a public sphere is perhaps not democratically resilient but is fragile, it becomes more prone to polarisation and fragmentation, and it cannot sustain the inclusive deliberation when subjected to shocks. So in this research, we try to do, 3 things differently. First, we shift our focus from security in a straightforward way to democracy. We're asking what deliberative democracy can offer in dealing with the challenges of violent extremism. And here we're not, as I mentioned, approaching violent extremism in a, preventative perspective. Some of our findings might maybe be relevant for this kind of work, but frankly, it's beyond the scope of our project and our expertise. Instead, we're thinking about how democracies respond to and hopefully contain the after effects of, say, a violent extremist attack or threat or propaganda video or what have you. So secondly, in reconceptualizing democratic resilience, we're trying to shift the focus from regime type to the quality of the public sphere. To date, research on democratic resilience is really all about the capacity for political systems to resist democratic backsliding, creeping authoritarianism, what have you. But in this research, we're instead interested in how the public sphere responds to and processes shocks like a violent extremist attack. And thirdly, we're trying to shift the focus, I suppose, from individuals and communities to the actors and institutions of the public sphere. And as I've mentioned, this includes government, it includes news media, it includes civil society organizations, and how their actions may contribute to limiting or even furthering the harm of violent extremist acts. And I suppose we see this as a way of, supplementing rather than trying to replace existing approaches to resilience. And so we hope that this opens new ways to think not only about resilience, but also the impacts of violent extremism and who has a role to play in addressing these impacts. So to understand how the public sphere responds to violent extremism, we undertook a case study of CVE in New South Wales. And the report draws on interviews conducted with New South Wales government stakeholders, civil society organisations in New South Wales, journalists reporting on and around violent extremism, academics working on and around violent extremism, social cohesion, democracy, and actually some of our interviewees are in the room, so thanks again for your time during the project. And these interviews were supplemented by a document analysis of publicly available materials on CVE in New South Wales, as well as a review of international best practice in the CVE and social cohesion spaces. So drawing on this empirical work and through the theory of deliberative democracy and its conceptualization of the public sphere, we identify, 7 key factors that matter for building democratic resilience, which are sort of up there on the poster on the slide. This includes, for example, how political leaders talk about violent extremism, how CVE is understood and implemented in government policy, and how government engages with civil society and the broader public. Now, importantly, these 7 factors and the ways forward they suggest that I'm going to go into in a moment, they're not prescriptive, right? They're a series of questions or issues that we think public sphere actors like the New South Wales government who commissioned this work should engage with in thinking about ways to address the challenges of violent extremism. So, moving now to some of those ways forward that I've been talking about. One of the big ones is the development or the ongoing development of speech guidelines for public-facing, in this instance, government actors, but it really can be any sort of public-facing actor, community leader, what have you. Because the way in which political leaders talk about violent extremism, particularly in the aftermath of an attack, and the communities that are impacted by such acts, it has a really enormous effect on the health of the public sphere and, by extension, democracy. So our research shows that speeches given by prominent public figures will really help to define events. They will shape the community's understanding of an attack, and they'll set the tone, crucially, for future deliberation and also policy formation. And so it's important that key public sphere actors, like government ministers, have a plan for how to respond with speech guidelines in place. So these are already in place in many jurisdictions, including New South Wales. New South Wales government has their strategic communications plan. But it's important that these speech guidelines are, continually developed and developed in a way, we think, that might promote democratic resilience. So based on our research, we suggest that there are, sort of several factors for political leaders to keep in mind when addressing the public in the wake of a violent extremist attack or threat. It's things like centering the stories of victims and survivors rather than perpetrators, contextualizing and localizing the risk of violent extremism rather than, engaging in inflammatory language, things like a clash of civilizations, for example, to support targeted communities rather than treating them as potential vectors of radicalization or threat. And also, crucially for us, I suppose, reiterating the democratic character of the political system and the tolerant and open character, ideally, of society more broadly. But it's also quite important, particularly for government, to clarify between countering violent extremism on the one hand and counter-terrorism and other security and intelligence agendas on the other. So, for example, in New South Wales, CVE is generally framed as distinct from counter-terrorism and is largely led by social policy agencies rather than law enforcement. This distinction is really clear at the government level and from the government's perspective, but as interviewees, particularly with civil society, with journalists and academics demonstrated, this distinction is not really clear to the wider public. And so this lack of clarity was seen by several of our interviewees as really limiting the possibility for community participation in countering violent extremism and social cohesion work. And in that respect, sort of undermined the objectives of the New South Wales CVE program. Now, our New South Wales government partners were very forthright, I suppose, in acknowledging these potential issues with respect to the ongoing overlap between CVE and CT. But some of our interviewees also raised the potential of new challenges being introduced through the incorporation of social cohesion within a CVE framework, which they thought may inadvertently reproduce stigmatisation. Now, the other thing that was somewhat related, that was really key, that came through in our interviews, was a need for an accurate and reliable information or database on violent extremism in Australia, because there's no uniform national database. And this was said by several of our interviewees to make it quite difficult to understand, I guess, the scope of the problem and assess at a national level the impact of initiatives to improve social cohesion. So developing a comprehensive national data set independently or perhaps in partnership with civil society and academia would provide a strong evidentiary base for deliberation and policy formation, we hope. So the public sphere can't be democratically resilient if members of Australian society feel marginalised and unable to participate confidently. And this is particularly pressing in, I guess, a post-9/11 context, where, as we heard repeatedly in our interviews, many Muslims feel that they are unable to fully participate in public life. And so it's vitally important, if the public sphere is to be resilient, that it reflects the diversity of Australian society. And one way to do this is through promoting and supporting multicultural and multilingual media to ensure diverse representation and voice in our public sphere. Multicultural and multilingual media also can play a really important role, not only in fostering inclusion and countering or helping limit marginalisation by increasing avenues for minority participation, but it also offers communities a potential site of narrative resistance. At the same time, it's also very important that public sphere actors, I think particularly governments, news media and civil society organisations, acknowledge the intercultural diversity that is present within communities. Communication from government and civil society, for example, should recognise this multiplicity of identities, particularly when community voices are engaged for co-creation or other deliberative or collaborative partnerships, while at the same time media needs to be really quite conscious of how voices and sources for reporting are selected so as to avoid unintentionally essentialising and fixing minority identities. So how a collective identity, an inclusive collective identity, is constructed in the public sphere is also really important for democratic resilience. And here we're particularly interested in the role of symbols and performances in articulating an inclusive and tolerant society. But there is, and this was kind of surprising for us in our research, particularly in a post-Link Cafe siege setting, that there's actually a real lack of policy guidance in this space in terms of how to deal with commemoration and memorialisation in the wake of a violent extremist attack. So commemoration and memorialisation is a really important opportunity to bring community together after a crisis, to heal, to grieve together. But it also presents an important opportunity for fostering democratic resilience, because it allows a space to contest the imagery of violence and to promote the democratic, inclusive, and tolerant character of society. Democratically resilient commemoration and memorialisation really needs to, I suppose, centre the needs of victims, of survivors, and also first responders. It needs to adopt time-sensitive implementation strategies, and it needs to ensure public consultation and participation in planning to make sure these events are inclusive, as well as, I suppose, inviting a critical reflection on what we value as a society. So by way of, I suppose, a bad example of this, despite its good intentions, was, following the Joe Cox assassination in 2016, following year, we had the great get-together, this commemorative event to show that British society had more in common. It was centred around like picnics, street parties, what have you. But it took place during Ramadan. So, of course, a significant portion of British society was unable to participate, which I guess undermines the whole coming together ethos of the event. So a key barrier to inclusiveness was, of course, the impact of media coverage on violent extremism. In particular, the harmful framing of communities that are affected by violent extremism can lead to the fracturing of the public sphere through stigmatisation. While on the other hand, sensationalist reporting of violent extremist actors and events can further the reach and harm of these narratives and provide these actors with legitimacy. So we really, I think, need best practice guidelines for reporting on sensitive topics, such as violent extremism. And we, of course, already have these in Australia in terms of reporting on suicide, right? And these are widely adopted frameworks for how to cover these sensitive issues in a way that minimises harm. So government and civil society, we think, should really look for avenues to work with news media to support them to develop and implement such practices. And this could be through, additional support for existing industry training programs like the 9 Fairfax or News Corp media cadetships, the development of industry standards through the Australian Press Council, or simply including media in academic conferences and government conferences around countering violent extremism, which, again, I should note the New South Wales government has actually started doing. Last couple to go through. How government actually engages with civil society and the wider public is really important. Several of our interviewees suggest that these partnerships are hindered both at the state and territory, but also the federal level, due to this perception of a lack of meaningful deliberation and a really quite limited range of perspectives, particularly on the community engagement side of things. And so to encourage trust and participation, it's really important that these engagements are consequential. And what we mean by that in the deliberative literature is that these engagements and the deliberations that ensue should have an impact on collective decision-making and social outcomes. And if they're not, or if they don't, that needs to be communicated back to participants. So obviously not every deliberation can have outcomes, but it's really important that communication is open and ongoing around this. It's also relatedly quite important to create spaces for listening and reflection. Both government at the state and territory and federal levels play a really crucial role in fostering these spaces where decision makers and other empowered elites can listen to and learn from the lived experiences of diverse communities. And these practices of institutional learning are quite important in shifting the responsibility from citizens to express their voice onto government, but also civil society organisations to make themselves receptive and responsive. And finally, then, the way in which information pollution and media literacy is addressed. Current programs are really just not fit for purpose. They're targeted primarily at online safety and at school children. We think that perhaps wider public health campaigns, similar to like Slip, Slop, Slap, might be a fruitful avenue here. And I'd note, actually, we currently have one ongoing in Canberra as part of the UN Day we had a couple of weeks ago. So we've got all these sort of posters addressing misinformation on Canberra buses at the minute. But while digital and media literacy is really important, it's also vital that government sort of not shirk responsibility in addressing the technological and policy infrastructures that allow information pollution to proliferate. So government needs to be really forthright in pushing particularly tech companies to sort of deal with these problems on their platforms. So to wrap up then, our research shows that democracies can take deliberative actions and deliberate actions outside of shocks to build resilience. this report was an opportunity, I guess, to try and take a novel approach to thinking through the issues of violent extremism and to see what, if anything, deliberative democracy can offer to address it. So we're very thankful again to the New South Wales government for supporting this endeavour. Of course, what I've talked about this morning is a very small subset of the report, which is available to read online now. Just search "Building Democratic Resilience." I think it's like number 4 on the Google list. We have quite good search engine optimization, which is good. But I think really key to drive home is that we see this report and its findings and the ways forward it suggests as really a starting point, a set of questions for public sphere actors to think about and reflect on. And so it's something we're continuing to build on through our work at the centre as part of this wider ARC project. So yeah, thanks for that. It was great to be here, and I'm looking forward to hopefully chatting with many of you over a coffee later on.
Thanks, Jordan. We have some time after the second presentation for a short Q&A, but I would now like to introduce Professor Paul Thomas online. So that's the first test, Ben, if we get this done. His presentation is called "Helping Intimate Bystanders to Act Early, the UK's Terrorism Prevention Initiative."
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Hi, Paul.
Hi, Mario. How are you? Yeah, good morning, everyone, or good evening, should I say, from the UK in my case. In my presentation today, I want to analyse a specific recent Preventing Violent Extremism initiative here in the UK, the Act Early campaign and web resource. And I hopefully will share my, I just need the other slideshow to come off, Mario, before I can share mine.
Ben's in the... I'm not sure how I can show you the 5-minute and 2-minute sign, Paul, but maybe you have to keep an eye on your watch.
Yeah, ask him to try and share now.
Can you share now your slides?
Yeah, is that okay? Yeah.
I can see, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so morning again, everyone. What I'd like to do is analyse a specific Preventing Violent Extremism initiative here in the UK, the Act Early campaign. Act Early specifically addresses a section of the population until recently under-considered by PVE policy approaches internationally, which is intimate bystanders, of those individuals potentially getting involved in terrorist planning or preparation. I'm going to consider the conception of this target group of intimate bystanders for intervention and the body of international research initiated by our AVERT convener, Professor Michelle Grossman, and which we've subsequently further developed with colleagues, and which has directly addressed this previous blind spot in international PVE approaches. The UK Act Early campaign is an intervention directly driven by this international research evidence. And I'm then going to both analyse the content and approach of Act Early and consider some of the issues and challenges around this intervention. So the first people who are likely to know about someone becoming involved in the pathway towards violence are their friends or family members, partners, co-workers, classmates, people we refer to as intimate bystanders. And closely connected here is the concept of leakage, whereby potential perpetrators intentionally or unintentionally signal their or communicate their intent to a third party. And Professor John Horgan in his work with Paul Gill and other colleagues identified a high incidence of leakage in cases of lone actor terrorism. And similarly, in what I now hesitate to call non-ideological mass violence incidents, such as school shooters or workplace shooters, there's again good evidence of a high rate of leakage to classmates, to co-workers, friends, family, etc. But at the same time, while we do know that internationally some terrorist plots have been disrupted thanks to early warnings or tip-offs from family members or friends, the number is small. And certainly in our work with the UK counter-terrorism police, they identified not only a small number of such tip-offs in the UK, but these tip-offs always coming very late on, so late on that hard policing intervention was needed, and certainly far too late for any preventative counselling, mentoring, diversionary activity, which is obviously what an intimate would want for someone close to them. Michelle has rightly identified the intimate bystanders as being a blind spot in our thinking and knowledge until recently. And until the last few years, we've known very little about the potential blocks and barriers to intimate bystanders sharing what they think they know or think they are noticing with the authorities, and also what might be the enablers and facilitators. So that leads on to our programme of community reporting thresholds research, which began in Australia with a grant to Michelle at the time when there was travel to Syria, and so largely focused on Muslim communities. We've subsequently developed that research, replicated that research in the UK, thanks to CREST funding, and then more recently, again, with colleagues in the USA and Canada. That research has used scenario-based interviewing, primarily with community members, but also with a group that we call professional practitioners, which include counter-terrorism police, but also civil society group representatives as well. Each study, as you can see from the numbers there, has grown the number of participants. We've also increased the range of hypothetical scenarios used to reflect the growing diversity of terrorist threats. So, building on what John said earlier, one of the scenarios we used in the recent Canadian study was an incel-based scenario. And we've also widened the range, the ethnic faith background of the respondents that we've drawn on. So we've now got, after 5 or 6 years, we have a large body of international research data with very consistent findings and implications. Additionally, there's been a parallel program of online research amongst young people, young adults, which again, John worked on with colleagues, including Mick Williams. And that body of research has produced findings very consistent to ours about the willingness to report someone close to you based on care and concern for that loved one, as well as for the community as a whole. So what are those key findings? So certainly, firstly, they're about care and concern for a loved one, and also for the community and safety of the community as well. That reporting is a stage process rather than an event. A large majority of respondents would engage in a variety of help-seeking behaviours, such as attempting to do their own research, about informally trying to get advice and guidance from family, from friends, or even for trusted people within their community. The perception of the likelihood of imminent violent action is the key threshold for a willingness to come forward and actually report. At the same time, a really high level of concern about reprisals from either the loved one or their extremist associates, as well as elements of community. In spite of the willingness to report, if there is that imminence of violence, there's a really low level of trust in law enforcement in many of the countries we've researched in, particularly in Australia, Canada, and US, but not interestingly in the UK, particularly amongst British Muslims, which may be surprising. I'll talk about that in a few moments. But in many of these countries, trusted community brokers are favoured as an alternative to law enforcement, both for sharing concerns and checking out concerns, as well as possibly even making reports, what we've called known faces in known places. Interesting, face-to-face reporting is strongly preferred in a number of the countries for reasons of communication and to get feedback. There is a great desire for structured support throughout the process of sharing concerns, and also a desire for what we've called the feedback loop of wanting to be kept informed about what their report is leading to and what its implications are. So although there's that willingness to report, there's also a great deal of confusion and ignorance about how to report, where to report, and where to find information about it. And in moving on to talk about our Act Early campaign in the UK, I'd like to highlight in particular a number of findings that have been strong and consistent through all the studies, but were particularly relevant in the UK in relation to the subsequent development of Act Early. And these were in particular these help-seeking sort of behaviours that people want to engage in their own research to attempt to understand what they're noticing and what they felt they were witnessing, but at the same time having no clear idea in any of the countries we've researched in about where to get such information, where to seek this advice. And so very commonly reverting to simply using a search engine to look for a website, even though they're not aware of what that would be. That they want the opportunity to ask questions, seek reassurances, and check out whether they are exaggerating or wrongly jumping to conclusions about what they're noticing in terms of their intimates' behaviour. That in doing so, they're driven by that care and concern, but in wanting to engage in these help-seeking or information-seeking behaviour, they see anti-terrorism hotlines, which is the one hotline or one source they're aware of in all these domains, as being completely inappropriate for their needs in relation to someone close to them. So the strength of that finding in the UK directly led to the Act Early campaign, which I'd now like to sort of go on and talk about. I've got a couple of images here from the Act Early website, and what you'll see from this landing page is how AVERT it is about being a police-led and police-run resource, and also being directly linked to the UK Prevent strategy. Both points controversial, and I'll directly address those in a few moments. But firstly, how did Act Early come about in relation to the UK community reporting thresholds research? Well, it was enabled by the project having an advisory group that included local government staff who work on community integration and multiculturalist integration, which we term community cohesion in the UK, and also were involved in preventing violent extremism at the grassroots level. But also we had counter-terrorism police representatives on the advisory group. At the end of the project, we carried out in-depth briefings for the UK Home Office, which leads on crime prevention, and also for the national leadership of UK counter-terrorism police. But then there was a whole series of in-depth briefings for CT police practitioners, which included a great deal of challenge and investigation and interrogation of the results with these CT practitioners in relation to what the implications were for a resource. It then led to Michelle and myself as the investigators of the project, lead investigators of the project, actually acting as official advisors on the design, tone and content of the Act Early campaign as it developed. Act Early offers information and advice on understanding and spotting the signs of radicalisation, which is, I appreciate, is a contested issue, and I know there's going to be presentations from colleagues on this and the role of frontline practitioners later today. It also looks at the real stories of families who've experienced radicalisation within the family and how they've been helped by the Prevent strategy interventions of counselling and mentoring through the channel scheme. And also guidance on how intimate bystanders can start conversations with their loved ones about the directions they seem to be going in or the material they seem to be engaging with. And it does give detail of what Prevent and Channel involved. It's been promoted through a number of parenting sites and organisations, as well as through the education system, and also through community networks. UK counter-terrorism police have developed national and regional community engagement forums that involves local and regional community representatives and organisations. which is somewhat controversial because some of those advisory networks involve, for instance, affiliates of the Muslim Council of Britain, which the UK government has an official policy of not engaging with. And you'll see there that ACT Early also offers the opportunity for phone conversations with trained police personnel. So just to move on then and explore some of these key issues and key sort of assumptions about the way ACT Early is set up. Firstly, as I said, it is AVERT about being led and staffed by the police. This reflects the sort of strong trust and support for the police amongst British Muslims. And I say British Muslims because certainly at the time of our UK research, ISIS and Al-Qaeda inspired extremism was seen as the biggest threat, and the majority of our respondents were young British Muslims. But we have clear research from Shadi Sana and other colleagues who've analysed large-scale sort of opinion surveys of the population that show very clearly that British Muslims have much greater support for policing than the rest of the population. And actually, British Muslims have greater confidence in counter-terrorism policing than other forms of policing, for instance, volume crimes such as burglary, etc. So there's a great deal of British Muslim support for counter-terrorism policing. But that is in great contrast, as I said earlier, to the findings of some of our other studies. So, for instance, the recently concluded US study showed very great reluctance amongst non-white sort of respondents to involve the police in a concern about a loved one because of fears about racialized violence towards the loved one, towards themselves as the reporter, and towards their community, which clearly raises great issues about third-party reporting that need to be addressed. ACT Early is led by the police, but it does also offer the opportunity of sharing concerns with non-government organisations such as Childline or NSPCC, who are trained to deal with radicalisation concerns. I think that mirrors, for instance, the non-government Step Together programme in New South Wales. ACT Early is also upfront about being led by and being directly connected to the PREVENT strategy. And the avertness of this labelling is precisely because the contested history of PREVENT, as colleagues will be aware, in the early years of PREVENT, there were very great concerns about PREVENT being a form of surveillance and also forms of spying that were undercover and were not avert about the role of police and the role of PREVENT strategy within community engagement. But at the same time, there is also, building on the support for police, there is also some contestation about the idea that British Muslims in particular are very, very sort of negative about the PREVENT strategy. There's been recent research that actually shows that 60 to 70% of British Muslims are completely unaware of the PREVENT strategy. And when they are made aware of it, they support the concept of it, providing it is done in a non-discriminatory manner. What the ACT Early campaign is then doing is really using a sort of paradigm of safeguarding, which is identifying vulnerability and trying to intervene before that develops into a sort of potentially criminal form of behaviour. And in doing so, it very much mirrors the PREVENT duty, which has been a mandatory duty, which has been imposed on all public servants in the UK since 2015, and again, a highly controversial sort of duty. But the research that I've been involved in with Joel Bushell, Tufiel Chowdhury and colleagues has shown very clearly that British educators are actually accepting of the PREVENT duty because of this safeguarding paradigm. They see it as consistent with their existing safeguarding responsibilities and consistent with the way they do safeguarding within their institution. Up till now, virtually all the referrals to channel through the PREVENT duty and through PREVENT have come from these public sector professionals with their mandated responsibility. Whereas what ACT Early is now offering the opportunity for community members to make referrals of their loved one. So in a way, and certainly with counterterrorism police, they overtly see this as the safeguarding in the community being the paradigm within which Act Early is attempting to engage with the community.
Paul, sorry to interrupt, you have 2 minutes left roughly, okay?
And I was about to say, Mario, I finished at that point. So
sorry to interrupt at that time. It wasn't very useful. I'm not going to use my privilege, the proverbial privilege as a chair, to ask the first question. I hope there are enough questions in the room so that I don't have to occupy that role. So the floor is open for about 10 minutes. So any questions for Jordan and Paul, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Heidi Mayberg. I'm from Royal Holloway, University of London, and I have a question to Dr. Jordan. I started thinking about your fourth step or the recommendation that promote multicultural and ethnic media in the public sphere. Can you please elaborate more on that a bit? Is it something that you in Australia will produce, or is it something that you will import from, let's say, India or other countries? And if you do think that importing is a good idea, then how would you prevent some problems that there might be?
Yeah, thank you for that question. To clarify, I guess we conceptualize this as like local, multilingual and ethnic media. And I should note Australia already has a world-leading sort of framework for this through the SBS, its television programming and radio. But we think it's important to find ways, whether that's through increased funding or other mechanisms for support for other forms of multicultural media. But you raise a good point around the potential challenges that, say, importing it may bring, and that don't have to import it to have those problems. So, you know, for us, as well as thinking about having a diversity of viewpoints and representation in the media, we, of course, would frame that through a perspective of like democratic resilience and would want that media to also reflect as much as possible values of like democratic integrity and so forth. So,
other questions?
My question is for Professor Thomas. Thank you very much for your presentation. You talk about trust between Muslim community in Australia, Canada, United States, and UK. And you mentioned that trust in UK is higher than other states that you have mentioned. And I agree with you because part of my research about trust. However, how can we build a trust with bystanders? How can we convince the people who are close to would-be terrorists to tip in their relatives? And I think this will make trust more even difficult. How you think about that?
I think obviously reporting someone close to you is the hardest thing that anyone's going to ever do. And there's no easy way of building that trust. But I think certainly what Act Early is offering is that possibility that if you report the concern early enough, there is the chance of not being criminalized. There is the chance of being counseled, mediated, except mentored away from that involvement. And so there is, and certainly all our research evidence across different countries, and I appreciate that we are putting people in hypothetical situations, but their response is that they would rather that their relative, their loved one, became involved with the criminal authorities than did something catastrophically damaging to themselves as well as to other people. But of course, this is not an easy question.
Thanks, Paul. Rita is next, and then we might have take you as the last. Maybe we can take both together. Rita, can you go first?
Thank you. My question's for Professor Paul Thomas. Is there any explanation as to why British Muslims trust the police so much higher compared to Australia and the US? And I was just thinking, like in Australia, we have a situation where, for example, a 15-year-old is currently being sentenced as an adult for socialising ISIS material, could be facing up to 15 years in jail. And I'm thinking of the signal that sends to the community in terms of reporting. So I'm not sure how that plays out in the UK, but what's your insight as to why the trust is so high in the UK compared to Australia?
I think the first thing I'd say is, although trust is high, there is a substantial number, proportion of Muslim communities that don't trust because the history, for instance, very clumsy counter-terrorism police, and also the very stigmatizing element of the first phase of the PREVENT strategy, which was overtly only about Muslims. I think the move away from that first phase is partly rebuilt sort of trust. In terms of the other countries, certainly, I think one relevant point is that we've looked at much more varied ethnic and racial sort of group of respondents. So it's not so much the case that American Muslims, for instance, were distrusting of the police, but certainly of other non-white, African Americans, for instance. And I think, if we take that back to Britain, where we overwhelmingly had young British Muslim respondents, if we'd been drawing on young Black British respondents, I think we would have much lower support of trust in the police, because Black British respondents, Black British communities have very low trust and have very real fears about racialized violence and racial discrimination by the police, very well founded. So I think that trust amongst British Muslims is not shared with by other non-white communities, for instance, in Britain.
Thanks, Paul. We have one last question. Keep it short, otherwise I get in trouble.
Thank you. I'll be very quick. Thank you for these presentations. I learned a lot. And my question is for Professor Thomas as well. I was wondering, in terms of the interface of the website, there were 2 men pictured, and I'm just wondering from a gender perspective whether you have any procedures in place that specifically speak to young women to get them involved or even report, and just and maybe that's something you're doing. I was just from the first, I'm not familiar with the program, just from the first kind of interface. Was wondering what you're doing in that regard. Thank you.
First thing I'd say is, although we advised, we don't choose the images. So, but there are a number of pages with different images used. And I'm hesitating to say how good the gender balance is in those images used. Certainly, a lot of the promotion has actually been aimed at family networks, family websites, etc. So I don't think there's assumptions about about it being a male issue or there being male actors involved. But I must admit, I don't think I can speak to the images used. Yeah, I was going to say